That animal washing its food in your backyard, the one tipping over your trash cans at 2 a.m., has a name that comes from indigenous people watching it literally scratch and grab at things with those tiny human-like hands. The full story of how that word traveled across centuries is stranger and more contested than almost anything else in North American etymology. To understand the name, you have to picture the eastern woodlands of North America before European contact. Dense forests, river systems, and communities of Algonquian-speaking peoples who spent generations observing the animals around them with extraordinary precision. These were not casual observers. The names they gave animals were often functional descriptions, almost like field notes compressed into a single word. A creature got named for the most memorable thing it did, or the most striking feature it had, and raccoons, frankly, are memorable. They investigate everything with their front paws. They press, probe, rotate, and, yes, scratch at objects with a dexterity that looks disturbingly purposeful. So, when Algonquian speakers needed a word for this animal, they reached for that behavior. The result was something that translates roughly as scratches with hands, or one who scratches with hands. Here's where the history gets genuinely complicated, and where we have to be honest about what we know and what we are still piecing together. The word raccoon, as it appears in English, is almost certainly a phonetic approximation of an Algonquian word. The problem is that Algonquian is not one language. It is a family of related languages, including Powhatan, Ojibwe, Lenape, Abenaki, and dozens of others. Each of those communities had their own version of the word, and early European settlers, who were not trained linguists, wrote down what they heard in wildly inconsistent ways. You get spellings like arakhun and ragrokum in colonial documents, which tells you the original sound was something English mouths found genuinely difficult to reproduce. Over time, the word compressed and anglicized into the version we use today. Now, the earliest documented record we have confidence in dates to around 2026 in terms of formal etymological cataloging, which tells you something important. This is a word whose roots were transmitted orally for so long that written records are fragmentary and late. The deeper linguistic origin remains officially unclear, which is the honest position of most contemporary linguists working in this space. But here's what the circumstantial evidence strongly suggests. Captain John Smith, writing about the Virginia colony in the early 1600s, recorded interactions with the Powhatan Confederacy and included vocabulary lists of local words. Smith was working in the region where Powhatan Algonquian was spoken, and his phonetic transcriptions, however imperfect, give us some of the earliest English-language encounters with these animal names. Smith was not an etymologist. He was a soldier and an explorer with a practical interest in communication. When he wrote down words, he was writing for survival and navigation, not for posterity's linguistic benefit. So his transcriptions have to be read carefully, cross-referenced against later missionary records and the work of people who spent more dedicated time with specific communities. Later, in the mid-1600s, Roger Williams produced a key of the language of the Narragansett people in what is now Rhode Island. Williams was unusual for his time in that he genuinely engaged with Algonquian languages as systems, not just as sounds to be approximately captured. His work gives us a more structured window into how these descriptive animal names functioned grammatically. Williams understood that the animal names in Narragansett were often participio constructions, words built around an action, not the thing that scratches in a noun sense, but something closer to the scratching with hands one, where the action is grammatically baked into the name itself. That linguistic structure is consistent across multiple Algonquian languages, which strengthens the scratches with hands interpretation considerably. A third figure worth mentioning is Heckewelder, John Heckewelder, a Moravian missionary who worked extensively with the Lenape people in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Heckewelder produced detailed notes on Lenape vocabulary and explicitly connected raccoon-related words to the concept of hand-like manipulation. His observations, published in the early 1800s, became a reference point for later scholars trying to reconstruct the word's deeper logic. The three-part picture that emerges, Smith's early phonetic capture, Williams's grammatical framework, and Heckewelder's semantic detail, builds a compelling case even without a single, clean origin document. The most common false belief floating around is that raccoon is a straightforward borrowing, one word from one language handed directly to English settlers, clean and traceable. That framing is wrong, and it flattens something genuinely interesting. There's no documented single-source word, no single community that handed this term to European colonists in one clean transaction. What actually happened was messier and more collaborative, in a coerced and unequal way. Different settler groups in different regions heard different Algonquian communities using functionally similar words for the same animal, and all of those encounters fed into the English version. The other misconception is subtler. Some popular etymology resources suggest the name refers to the raccoon washing food, the hand-washing behavior, But the washing behavior, while real, is not what the name encodes. The name is about scratching and probing, the investigative behavior. The washing interpretation is a later folk reading, projected backward onto a word that predates any English speaker watching a raccoon rinse a piece of food in a stream. The scratches with hands, meaning surfaces in unexpected places today. Wildlife biologists and animal behaviorists frequently reference raccoon manual dexterity in academic papers, often noting that raccoons have more sensory nerve endings in their front paws than almost any other North American mammal. They are, in a very literal sense, built to scratch with hands. Rehabilitation workers who handle raccoons describe the experience as having your hands investigated by something that feels unsettlingly intentional. The original Algonquian speakers were not being poetic. They were being accurate. The name also echoes in conservation discussions about urban wildlife. Raccoons have expanded their range dramatically because their hand-like dexterity lets them solve problems, open latches, pry lids, navigate human-built environments in ways most animals cannot. The behavior that named them is also the behavior that made them one of the most successful urban mammals on the planet. The raccoon's name sits inside a much broader pattern of Algonquian animal naming that emphasizes behavior over appearance. Compare this to the moose, whose name comes from an Algonquian word meaning he strips bark, referencing how moose feed, or the caribou, derived from a word meaning snow shoveler, describing how the animal digs through snow for food. This is a fundamentally different naming logic from European traditions, which more often categorized animals by color, size, or resemblance to known species. English settlers naming new animals frequently defaulted to comparisons. The American robin was named for its red breast like a European robin, even though the two birds are not closely related. Algonquian naming instead asked, what does this animal do that nothing else does quite the same way? That behavioral naming philosophy has had a quiet but persistent influence on North American English vocabulary. A significant number of the animal names English speakers use every day are Algonquian in origin, and many of them carry these compressed behavioral descriptions that most speakers have completely lost track of. The word opossum follows a similar pattern, derived from an Algonquian word meaning white dog or white beast, referencing coloring. Woodchuck has nothing to do with wood or chucking. It comes from an Algonquian word that referred to the animal's burrowing. What the raccoon's name does that others do not is preserve something almost philosophical about the animal. It does not describe what the raccoon looks like.